A trucker finds this 4-year-old girl alone and abandoned on the highway. But when he tries to help her, her millionaire father does something terrible. Comment on what you think is going to happen. Your opinion is very important. And subscribe to my channel to support my work. Your help is very important. The rain relentlessly battered the windshield of the truck as Big Joe Peterson, 47, squinted, trying to see the road ahead. The dashboard clock read 3:42 a.m. The headlights barely pierced the curtain of water falling. On I-90, the main interstate that cuts through Butte, Montana, his calloused fingers drummed nervously on the steering wheel as he fought off the fatigue of yet another grueling trip. The trucker had driven that same route hundreds of times in the last 10 years, ever since he decided to bury himself in work to try to forget his past. The memories, however, always found a way to return in the lonely hours of the night, especially on nights like this. The weight of the cargo and the responsibility of delivering it on time kept him focused. He repeated to himself like a mantra. That's when his eyes caught something unusual on the side of the road. At first, he thought it was just another reflection of the rain on the asphalt. But his instinct made him slow down. As he got closer, the shape became clearer. A small silhouette, practically invisible in the darkness, if not for the reflected shine of something metallic in her hands. Big Joe slammed on the brakes, making the tires screech on the wet asphalt. His heart leapt when he finally understood what his eyes were witnessing. A little girl, no more than 6 years old, soaked to the bone, standing alone on the side of the highway. Her pale little face had a blank expression, as if she were in shock. "Good Lord!" he exclaimed, jumping out of the cab without caring about the rain now soaking his own clothes. He approached cautiously, not to scare her even more. The little one was trembling violently, her lips purple with cold, her dark hair plastered to her wet face. In her tiny hands, she tightly clutched a silver locket. "Hey there, sweetie. You okay?" he asked, crouching down to her level. The girl just shook her head no, without uttering a sound. Big Joe looked around, desperate. No cars in sight, no houses nearby, just the darkness of the night and the deafening sound of the rain. He tried to grab his cell phone from his pocket, but remembered that it had stopped working earlier that day. "What's your name?" he tried again. The answer came in an almost inaudible whisper. "Isabel. Isabel, where are your parents?" The question seemed to awaken something in the girl, who began to tremble even more, repeating softly, "Daddy's gonna be mad. Daddy's gonna be mad." The trucker felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Something was very wrong with this situation. He couldn't leave her there, exposed to the elements and the dangers of the road. The nearest gas station was about 6 miles away. There he could ask for help. Call the authorities. "Come on, sweetie. I'm going to take you somewhere safe," he said, holding out his hand. Isabel hesitated for a moment, but eventually accepted. Big Joe led her to the truck, helping her climb into the cab. He turned the heater on full blast and took his extra jacket from the glove compartment, wrapping it around the girl's tiny shoulders. During the ride, he tried to ask more questions, but Isabel remained silent, except for the phrase she occasionally repeated about her father being angry. Her frightened little eyes were fixed on the road ahead, as if she feared something Big Joe couldn't see. The lights of the gas station finally appeared in the distance, bringing a small relief to the trucker's distressed heart. However, as he approached the location, he noticed an unusual amount of activity for that time of night. 3 black executive-type cars were parked in front of the station, and several men in suits, despite the rain, seemed to be looking for something in the surrounding area. Before Big Joe could fully process the scene, one of the men pointed at his truck, and immediately all eyes turned in his direction. One of the vehicles sped off, stopping right in front of the truck, forcing him to brake hard. From the first car stepped out a tall man of imposing stature, wearing an impeccable suit. His eyes flashed with fury as he approached with long strides. Isabel shrank in her seat, clutching the locket even tighter against her chest. "Stop right there!" thundered the man's voice, while 4 other armed security guards surrounded the truck. "What do you think you're doing with my daughter?" The businessman, Tobias Ashton, advanced toward the truck with a calculated fury in every step. His eyes, cold as steel, alternated between the frightened figure of Isabel and Big Joe's perplexed face. The security guards maintained their strategic positions, creating an intimidating cordon around the vehicle. "Sir, it's not what you think," Big Joe tried to explain, raising his hands in surrender. "I found your daughter alone on the side of the road. I was bringing her in to get help." "Shut your mouth!" Tobias roared, his face contorted with rage. He turned to those present at the gas station, who were watching the scene with curiosity. "You are all witnesses. This man kidnapped my daughter." Big Joe's heart froze. People began to gather, whispering and pointing. Gas station employees, other truckers, and even some customers who stopped for gas formed a small crowd. Their accusing stares weighed on Big Joe like lead. "Please, I need to explain." He tried again, but was interrupted by 2 security guards who abruptly pulled him from the cab. Meanwhile, Tobias rushed to get Isabel, who was trembling violently. "Honey, are you okay? Did he hurt you?" the businessman asked, his voice now feigning concern. The girl didn't answer, still clinging to the locket. Her frightened eyes met Big Joe's for a brief moment before fixing on the ground. "Daddy's gonna be mad," she murmured softly, but only Big Joe could hear. One of the security guards, who had searched the truck's cab, approached Tobias with something in his hands, the jacket that Big Joe had used to cover Isabel. "Sir, we found this. He must have used it to—" "Evidence," Tobias declared, cutting off the security guard's sentence. "More proof of this monster's crime." At that moment, a highway patrol car entered the gas station, probably called by one of those present. 2 officers quickly got out, absorbing the scene before them. Tobias immediately took the lead, his posture changing to that of a respectable citizen and concerned father. "Officers, thank God, this man kidnapped my daughter. I have several witnesses who can confirm that we caught him red-handed." The people around began to agree, some inventing details they hadn't witnessed. "I saw him speeding past," someone shouted. "The girl was crying," added another. Big Joe watched, stunned, as his life crumbled before his eyes. The officers handcuffed him without giving him a chance to explain. His truck, his only source of income, was seized as evidence. The cargo he was carrying, ignored in the middle of the confusion, represented a loss he couldn't afford. In the midst of the chaos, a woman approached Isabel discreetly. It was Margaret, the Ashton family's housekeeper, who had arrived in one of the cars from the entourage. Her attentive eyes noticed something strange in the girl's behavior. "Come on, dear," she said softly, holding out her hand. "Let's take you home." Isabel hesitated, her gaze alternating between Margaret and her father, who continued to put on a show for the officers and onlookers. The housekeeper noticed that the girl's small hands were clutching something tightly. "What do you have there, Isabel?" she asked quietly. Before the girl could answer, Tobias appeared beside them, snatching the locket from his daughter's hands with a brusque movement. For a fraction of a second, his face showed an expression of panic upon recognizing the object. He quickly put it in his coat pocket. "Margaret, take Isabel to the car. She needs a hot bath and rest," he ordered, his voice brooking no argument. The housekeeper obeyed, but not without casting one last look at Big Joe, who was being placed in the patrol car. There was something about the story that didn't add up. In 6 years of working for the Ashtons, she had never seen Isabel so frightened, and the fear in her eyes didn't seem to be of the supposed kidnapper. In the weeks that followed, Big Joe's life turned into a nightmare. His name was splashed across all the local newspapers. "Kidnapping trucker terrorizes traditional Ashton family," the headlines read. Tobias Ashton's influence was evident in every biased report, in every manipulated statement. With no money to hire a good lawyer, Big Joe was represented by an overworked public defender who barely had time to study his case. His attempts to explain the truth were systematically ignored or distorted. The judge, known to frequent the same social circles as Tobias, denied all requests for habeas corpus. Meanwhile, at the Ashton mansion, Margaret observed worrying changes in Isabel's behavior. The girl, who was already naturally quiet, now hardly spoke. Her nightmares, which had previously been occasional, became constant. Several times, the housekeeper found her huddled in a corner of her room, muttering disjointed words about her mother. On one of those nights, while helping Isabel get ready for bed, Margaret noticed purple marks on the girl's arm. "How did you get hurt, dear?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Isabel quickly pulled down the sleeve of her pajamas to cover the marks. "I fell," she replied automatically, but her eyes said something else. It was the same blank look from that night on the road. The housekeeper decided to investigate discreetly. During her days off, she began to research the Ashtons' past. That's how she discovered the first clues about Clarice, Isabel's mother, who had disappeared 2 years earlier. The reports at the time vaguely mentioned psychological problems and a possible escape, but something didn't match the few memories Margaret had of her former boss. One day, while tidying Tobias's office, a task that was normally prohibited when he was home, she found a hidden folder with medical documents in Clarice's name. They were psychiatric reports that seemed forged, dates that didn't match, different signatures on documents supposedly from the same doctor. Her heart raced when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Quickly, she took photos of the documents with her cell phone and put everything back in place, seconds before Tobias entered the room. The businessman stared at her suspiciously. "What are you doing here, Margaret?" "Just cleaning, sir," she replied, showing the duster she always carried. The previous housekeeper left a lot of dust accumulated on the furniture. Tobias continued to watch her for a few moments. "I don't want anyone messing with my office without my express authorization. Understand?" "Yes, sir. I'm sorry." That night, after making sure everyone was asleep, Margaret examined the photos she had taken. Among the documents were also receipts from a private clinic in the Montana mountains, dating back a few months. If Clarice had disappeared 2 years ago, why were there recent medical expenses in her name? The housekeeper kept the evidence in a safe place, knowing she would need more information before acting. Her intuition told her that the truth about that night on the road was connected to Clarice's disappearance, and that the locket Isabel was carrying was a fundamental piece of that puzzle. What Margaret didn't know was that her discoveries had only scratched the surface of a much larger and darker secret, a secret that Tobias Ashton was willing to protect at any cost. In the small cell of the Butte, Montana detention center, Big Joe spent hours staring at the gray walls, his mind replaying the events of that fateful night. The thin mattress barely softened the hardness of the metal bunk, but the physical discomfort was the least of his problems. With each passing day, he felt his former life slip through his fingers like water. The news of the seizure of his truck and the loss of the contract with the trucking company came as a punch to the stomach. In just 3 weeks, everything he had worked for over the past 10 years had unraveled. The installments on the truck loan began to fall behind, and the bank was already threatening foreclosure. During the preliminary hearings, Tobias Ashton always appeared impeccably dressed, accompanied by a team of expensive lawyers who spoke fluently about the dubious character of the accused. The businessman had hired a private investigator who discovered Big Joe's past, the tragedy he was so eager to forget. "Your Honor," argued Tobias's lawyer, "the defendant has a history of unstable behavior since the accident that claimed his family. Medical records show that he refused to seek psychological help at the time. preferring to isolate himself. Who can guarantee that he didn't develop dangerous tendencies during those years of solitude on the roads? The public defender assigned to Big Joe could barely keep up with the prosecution's legal maneuvers. When he tried to present his client's version, he was interrupted by technical objections that the judge invariably upheld. Meanwhile, at the Ashton mansion, Margaret continued her silent investigation. The housekeeper had developed a discreet system for documenting her findings. Using a coded notebook she hid inside an old Bible in her room. There, she wrote down every suspicious behavior of Tobias, every strange reaction of Isabel, every detail that could help unravel the mystery. On a particularly tense morning, Margaret was tidying Isabel's room when she found something disturbing. Hidden under the girl's mattress was a drawing made with crayons. The image showed a female figure with long hair inside what appeared to be a house or room with bars on the windows. In the corner of the paper was a representation of the same locket that the girl was carrying on the night of the road. "What did you find there?" Tobias's deep voice boomed from the doorway, making Margaret jump in fright. "Just organizing Isabel's toys, sir," she replied, discreetly trying to fold the drawing and hide it in her apron pocket. Tobias crossed the room in 3 long strides, his hand extended in a silent command. Margaret felt her stomach sink as she handed over the paper. The boss's face transformed as he examined the drawing, a vein pulsing in his temple. "Who else saw this?" he asked, his voice dangerously controlled. "No one, sir. I just found it." Tobias tore the drawing into tiny pieces, letting them fall into the trash can. "Isabel has a very fertile imagination," he said, his tone leaving no room for questions. "Don't encourage these fantasies." That same afternoon, Margaret watched Isabel playing in the yard when she noticed an unfamiliar car parked across the street. A woman in dark glasses was observing the mansion with interest. After a few minutes, the stranger made eye contact with Margaret and made a discreet gesture, beckoning her. With a racing heart, the housekeeper verified that Tobias was in a meeting in his office before crossing the street. The woman introduced herself as Elizabeth, Clarice's sister. "I know it's risky for you to talk to me," Elizabeth said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I need your help. My sister didn't disappear willingly." The two arranged to meet the next day, during Margaret's day off, at a discreet coffee shop downtown. There, Elizabeth revealed that she had returned urgently from overseas after receiving an anonymous letter with a recent photo of Clarice. "The postmark is from here in Montana," she explained, showing the envelope to the housekeeper. "And there's more. I found records of purchases made with a card in Clarice's name at a pharmacy in the mountains. How could she be making purchases if she was missing?" Margaret felt a chill as she recognized the name of the mountain town. It was the same one that appeared on the medical receipts she had photographed in Tobias's office. Meanwhile, in prison, Big Joe received an unexpected visitor. Patty Silver, a lawyer known for taking cases pro bono when she believed in the defendant's innocence, had become interested in his story after reading a small note in the local newspaper that presented inconsistencies in the case. "Mr. Peterson," she said, sitting down in front of him in the visiting room, "I read the files of your case, and something doesn't add up. Why would a kidnapper stop precisely at a busy gas station? And why are there records of calls from the girl's cell phone to an unknown number minutes before you found her?" For the first time in weeks, Big Joe felt a flicker of hope. Someone was finally willing to listen to his side of the story. On the same day, investigative journalist Mark Pierce began to sniff out something strange in the case. A veteran of the police beat, he knew Tobias Ashton's methods well. It wasn't the first time the businessman had used his influence to manipulate public opinion. Mark began to investigate the last 2 years of activities of Tobias's construction company. He discovered a suspicious pattern of victories in public bids, always with prices minimally below those of competitors, as if he had privileged information. Even more intriguing were the generous donations he made to the traditional 4th of July parade in Butte, an event that moved millions in resources. "Chief, there's something big here," Mark told his editor. "I think the trucker's case is just the tip of the iceberg." What no one knew was that, on that same night, Dr. Olivia Mendez, the child psychologist who was treating Isabel, made a disturbing discovery during a therapy session. Using drawing techniques and playing with dolls, the girl finally began to open up about the events of that night. "Mommy came to see me secretly," whispered Isabel while manipulating a doll. "She said she was hurt, but that she was going to pick me up soon. Then Daddy came and—" The girl stopped abruptly, dropping the dolls. Her eyes filled with tears as she shrank back on the couch. The psychologist tried to calm her, but Isabel entered a state of agitation that required the premature end of the session. Dr. Olivia spent the night awake, debating between her duty of professional secrecy and the growing certainty that she was facing something much more serious than an alleged kidnapping. Her clinical intuition told her that Isabel wasn't making up stories. There was truth in her fear, especially when she talked about her father. The psychologist didn't know it, but her notes from that session would become fundamental pieces of a much larger puzzle, a puzzle that was beginning to take shape through the parallel discoveries of Margaret, Elizabeth, Patty, and Mark. Each of them, without knowing the others, was pulling a different thread from the same web of lies that Tobias Ashton had woven so carefully. And at the center of it all was that locket, the same one that Isabel clung to so tightly on the rainy night, the same one that appeared in her drawings, the same one that made Tobias lose his composure whenever it was mentioned. What did that little piece of silver hold? What secret was so important as to justify the destruction of an innocent man's life? The sun had barely risen when Elizabeth parked her rental car in front of the coffee shop where she had arranged another meeting. With Margaret, her hands trembled slightly as she held a worn brown folder, the result of 2 weeks of tireless investigation into the whereabouts of her sister Clarice. The housekeeper arrived punctually at 6 o'clock, taking advantage of the fact that Tobias was traveling on business and had dismissed her services for a few days. Her face showed the weariness of sleepless nights, but her eyes shone with the determination of someone who had discovered something important. "I got more information," Margaret said in a low voice as soon as she sat down. "Tobias has a cabin in the mountains. It's in an isolated area, near the town where we found those records of Clarice's purchases." Elizabeth opened her folder, discreetly spreading some photographs on the table. "Look what I found," she whispered, pointing to an old photo where Clarice smiled, wearing the famous locket. "This locket belonged to our grandmother. She gave it to Clarice shortly before she passed away. Inside it there's a secret compartment." "Compartment?" Margaret leaned in, interested. "What was inside?" "A key. Clarice never told me what it was for, but she always carried the locket with her. The last time we spoke on the phone, 2 years ago, she mentioned that she had discovered something terrible about Tobias. She said she was gathering evidence and that she needed to protect those documents." The two women exchanged meaningful glances. "The day after that call," continued Elizabeth, her voice faltering, "I received the news that my sister had disappeared. Tobias spread to everyone that she had mental problems, that she had run away. I never believed that." Meanwhile, in his office at the local newspaper, Mark Pierce connected dots that seemed, at first glance, disconnected. The journalist had discovered an interesting pattern in the donations that Tobias's construction company made to the 4th of July parade in Butte. "Look at this," he explained to his assistant, pointing to a spreadsheet on his computer. "Every year, the construction company donates exactly 15% more than the previous year. But when you compare that with the public contracts they win, You notice a curious coincidence. Each donation happens exactly 3 days after the payment for a major municipal project. Mark had spent the last few days discreetly interviewing former employees of the construction company. One of them, who preferred to remain anonymous, revealed something disturbing. Mrs. Ashton worked in the company's financial department. She started asking questions about some inconsistencies in the accounting. A few days later, she vanished. In Dr. Olivia's office, Isabel was making slow but significant progress. The psychologist had developed a special technique to help the girl express herself. Through a dollhouse, she allowed her to recreate scenes from her daily life. That afternoon, something extraordinary happened. Isabel picked up a doll representing her mother and placed it in a room of the toy house that she had transformed into a kind of prison, with pieces of paper simulating bars on the windows. "This is where Mommy lives now," said the girl with an eerie naturalness. "She can't leave because she's sick, that's what Daddy said." Dr. Olivia felt a chill. Carefully she asked, "And where is this house, Isabel?" The girl hesitated, biting her lip. "It's a secret. Daddy said that if I tell anyone, Mommy will get sicker." In prison, Big Joe was again visited by Patty Silver. The lawyer had made a surprising discovery while investigating the history of the security cameras at the gas station where he was detained. "The recordings from that night have mysteriously disappeared," she explained, "but I managed to locate an employee who was on duty. He confirms your version. You arrived at the station alone, without any other vehicle following you. Tobias's cars were already there, waiting." "How did they know I would be there?" asked Big Joe, confused. "That's the question we need to answer," replied Patty, her eyes shining with determination. "And there's more. I gained access to the cell phone records from the area. There was a cell tower near the location where you found Isabel. The records show a call made from the girl's cell phone to an unregistered number minutes before your encounter." The lawyer paused, consulting her notes. "The interesting thing is that this same number received a call from Tobias's cell phone immediately afterward. Seconds later, all his cars headed to the gas station." Big Joe felt a knot in his stomach. "You mean that—" "Exactly," completed Patty. "It seems that someone was monitoring Isabel's movements that night, and that someone notified Tobias immediately." On the other side of town, Margaret took advantage of the boss's absence to make a crucial discovery. Cleaning Tobias's office, she found an envelope hidden inside an old accounting book. Inside were recent photographs. Clarice, visibly distraught, in a room with barred windows. The photos were dated just 3 months ago. With trembling hands, the housekeeper photographed the images with her cell phone. That's when she noticed something in the background of one of the photos. A painting on the wall showed a landscape characteristic of the Montana mountains. She knew that place. It was the view from the Ashtons' cabin. That same night, Elizabeth received an anonymous call. A distorted voice whispered, "Look for Stella Grant. She was the housekeeper before Margaret. She knows what happened at the cabin." The search for Stella wasn't easy. The former housekeeper had moved to a town in the countryside after being fired by Tobias 2 years before. When Elizabeth finally found her, she discovered a woman tormented by fear. "I saw things," said Stella, her hands clutching a cup of tea already cold. "Things that no one should see." Clarice discovered incriminating documents in Tobias's office, something about embezzlement from public works. She confronted him at the cabin. Stella stopped, swallowing hard. "That night I heard screams. When I went up to see what was happening, I saw Tobias dragging Clarice to the basement. She was bleeding. The next day, he fired me. He said that if I opened my mouth, I would have the same fate." Meanwhile, Mark Pierce followed another lead. Investigating the company's records, he discovered a series of shell companies used to inflate construction materials. The extra money was laundered through donations to the 4th of July parade, which in turn was managed by a foundation controlled by Tobias's allies. "It's a perfect scheme," muttered the journalist to himself, organizing his notes. "The parade is so traditional, so important to the town, that no one questions the donations, and the money siphoned from public works returns clean to the right pockets." What no one knew was that all these parallel discoveries were about to connect in an explosive way. That same night, Dr. Olivia received a disturbing call. It was Isabel secretly using Margaret's cell phone. "Doctor," whispered the girl, her voice trembling, "Mommy is here. I saw her today when Daddy took me to the cabin. She's not sick. She's imprisoned. And now Daddy found out that I know—" The call was abruptly cut off, leaving the psychologist. In panic, without thinking twice, she picked up the phone to call Patty Silver. It was time for all the pieces of the puzzle to come together. Isabel's call triggered a race against time. Dr. Olivia, with her hands still trembling, conferred by phone with Patty Silver, sharing her concern about the girl's safety. The lawyer, in turn, had already activated Mark Pierce, who immediately began mobilizing his contacts to locate the Ashtons' cabin in the mountains. "We can't involve the police directly," warned Patty, her voice tense. "Tobias has too much influence. We need concrete evidence before any official action." Margaret, who had returned hastily to the mansion after receiving an urgent call from Tobias ordering her presence, found the house in a heavy atmosphere. The security guards seemed more alert than usual, and sounds of argument came from the boss's office. "Are you sure no one else saw?" Tobias's voice thundered through the door. "If that girl opened her mouth—" "Don't worry, boss," replied a male voice that Margaret recognized as belonging to Rick, the head of security. "We've already cut the line on the cell phone she used. No one will believe a child's word." The housekeeper felt her heart race. She needed to find a way to warn Elizabeth about what was happening. That's when she noticed something unusual. The folder of documents that always stayed locked in the office drawer was partially visible through the crack in the door, its contents scattered on the table. Taking advantage of a moment of distraction from the security guards, Margaret managed to take some photos with her cell phone through the crack. The documents revealed something appalling. In addition to the money laundering scheme through the 4th of July parade, there were records of bribes paid to public officials to falsify inspection reports for the construction company's projects. At the same instant, Mark Pierce made a crucial discovery in his archives. Cross-referencing satellite data with records of rural properties, he identified the exact location of the Ashtons' cabin. The property was registered in the name of one of the shell companies he was investigating. "There's something even stranger," he told Patty by phone. "In the last 2 years, there's been a significant increase in the location's electricity consumption. The consumption pattern suggests that someone lives there permanently, but officially, the cabin is only used on weekends." Meanwhile, Elizabeth obtained valuable information from a former employee of the cabin. There was a basement that wasn't on the original floor plan of the house. The room had been built secretly with reinforced walls and an independent ventilation system. Mrs. Ashton discovered irregularities in the construction company's accounts, revealed the employee, an elderly gentleman who worked as a gardener for years. She started gathering documents, saving evidence. The day she disappeared, she had come to the cabin to confront her husband. The gardener paused, his aged face marked by guilt. "I should have done something. That night I heard screams. Later the boss started bringing construction material, always in the early hours. That's when they built the basement." In prison, Big Joe received an unexpected visit, a man who identified himself as Tobias's former driver. "I don't have much time," he said, nervously looking over his shoulder. "But I need to tell you what I know. The night you found the girl, It wasn't a coincidence. Mrs. Ashton had managed to make contact with her daughter through a hidden cell phone. She was planning to run away with Isabel. The driver explained that Tobias discovered the plan and set a trap. He knew that his wife would try something during the 4th of July parade, when security would be more focused on the events in the town. What he didn't expect was you to show up and complicate everything. Dr. Olivia, analyzing her notes from the sessions with Isabel, began to notice a pattern in the girl's drawings. In addition to the female figure behind bars, there was always a detail that previously seemed insignificant, a bluebird on the window. "Doctor," Isabel had said in one session, "there are many bluebirds at the cabin. They sing to Mommy every day." The psychologist searched quickly. The species of bird that Isabel drew was typical of a specific altitude in the Montana mountains, exactly in the region where Mark had located the cabin. Margaret, returning to her room after a tense day, found an anonymous note under her door. "I know what you discovered in the office. I have more evidence. Meet me tomorrow at the corner coffee shop. S.G." The initials could only be Stella Grant, the former housekeeper. But why had she returned, and why choose this moment to make contact? The answer came the next morning. During the secret meeting, Stella had kept something all these years, Clarice's cell phone, with all the evidence she had collected about Tobias's schemes. "She gave it to me the night she disappeared," explained Stella, her hands trembling as she handed over the device. "She said that if something happened to her, I should wait for the right moment to reveal everything." The cell phone contained photos of documents, recordings of conversations, and more importantly, the exact location of the secret compartment, where Clarice kept the physical evidence, behind a false panel in the cabin's office. Meanwhile, Tobias was beginning to feel the net closing in. His contacts in the police had alerted him to suspicious movements. Someone was investigating his properties in the mountains. "Prepare everything," he ordered Rick. "We're going to resolve this situation once and for all. Tonight." What he didn't know was that each person he had harmed in his climb to power, Big Joe, Margaret, Stella, the former driver, the gardener, had become a piece in a larger puzzle. And now those pieces were beginning to come together. Patty Silver, gathering all the information she had collected, prepared an extensive document detailing every aspect of the case: the kidnapping hoax, Clarice's disappearance, the corruption, schemes, all connected by the common thread of Tobias Ashton's unbridled ambition. The lawyer knew they needed to act fast. The tone of Isabel's last call, the suspicious movement at the cabin, the agitation of the security guards, everything indicated that Tobias was planning something drastic. "We have to do this right," she told Mark. "One chance is all we're going to get," the journalist agreed, finalizing his explosive article about the case. The text was ready to be published as soon as they had final confirmation, the exact location of Clarice. What no one expected was that Isabel, in her insightful innocence, had already discovered the most important secret of all. In the last session with Dr. Olivia, before the desperate call, the girl had made a different drawing. Her mother's locket, perfectly detailed, with a small note next to it that would change everything. "This is where Mommy kept the map," she had said, pointing to the drawing. "She showed it to me before Daddy came. She said that one day I would understand." Now, with all the pieces moving towards an inevitable confrontation, time was running out. Tobias Ashton, in his office, looked out the window while making a last call. On the other end of the line, a raspy voice confirmed, "Everything is ready for tonight, boss. The cabin will be destroyed, along with any evidence that still exists." Boom. What he didn't know was that at that exact moment, 5 different people were heading to the Montana mountains, each carrying a piece of the puzzle that finally would reveal the whole truth. Night fell on the Montana mountains as a storm. formed on the horizon. The heavy air carried the promise of rain, much like that fateful night when it all began. In the back seat of Patty Silver's car, Big Joe watched the landscape with apprehension. His temporary release, secured only hours before through an emergency habeas corpus, still seemed unreal. "Remember," instructed Patty, her eyes fixed on the winding road. "We just need the evidence, no direct confrontation." Next to her, Mark Pierce typed frantically on his laptop, coordinating with his team at the newspaper. "The article is ready to be published as soon as we give the signal." A few miles ahead, in another vehicle, Margaret and Elizabeth followed the same path, guided by the coordinates that Stella had provided. Clarice's cell phone, now unlocked thanks to a clue left on Isabel's locket, revealed much more than they expected. "Look at this," said Elizabeth, showing a series of photos to the housekeeper. Clarice photographed every compromising document she found. Inflated contracts, false invoices, payments to ghost employees. She built a complete case against Tobias. Margaret gripped the steering wheel tighter, remembering the last time she saw Isabel. The girl had been rushed to the cabin by Tobias, who claimed he needed some family time. And the look of terror on the child's face said it all. In a third car, more discreet, Dr. Olivia followed with Stella. The former housekeeper knew every detail of the cabin, every entrance, every blind spot of the security cameras. "There's a service entrance in the back," she explained. "The security guards never pay much attention there, especially during the shift change." The plan was coordinated. While Patty and Mark created a distraction at the main entrance, Margaret and Elizabeth would enter through the back. Dr. Olivia and Stella would stay at a strategic point, ready to provide support and, above all, take care of Isabel as soon as they found her. What they didn't know was that Tobias was also heading to the cabin, his powerful car cutting through the night a few miles ahead. Next to him, Rick coordinated a cleaning team over the radio. "Everything is prepared, boss, as soon as you give the order. There won't be anything left to tell the story." In the back seat, Isabel hugged her knees, trembling. Tobias had discovered her call to Dr. Olivia, and since then hadn't allowed his daughter to leave his sight. "You're going to learn to be quiet," he had said, his voice dripping with threat. In the cabin, Clarice sensed the unusual agitation. After 2 years imprisoned in the specially built basement, she had developed an acute sensitivity to the sounds and movements of the house. Something was different. The security guard's footsteps were more frequent, more nervous. Through a tiny crack in the ventilation, she could see the sky darkening. The lights in the cabin began to turn on one by one. Earlier than normal, raised voices argued upstairs. "It has to be today," said a voice. "The boss is coming personally to oversee everything." Clarice's heart raced. In 2 years of captivity, Tobias rarely appeared, preferring to keep his distance from his prisoner. If he was coming now, something big was about to happen. On the road, the first drop of rain hit the windshield of Patty's car. Big Joe looked at the sky, a shiver running down his spine. "It's just like that night," he murmured. "What did you say?" asked Mark, turning around. "The rain, the darkness. It's all like the night I found Isabel," explained the trucker. "Only now I know it wasn't a coincidence. She was trying to get to her mother." The revelations of the last few hours still echoed in his mind. Clarice's escape plan, carefully orchestrated over months of captivity. The hidden cell phone she got through a sympathetic employee. The secret messages to her daughter, teaching her about the locket, preparing her for the right moment. "Tobias always underestimated his own daughter," commented Patty. "Never imagined that a 6-year-old could be so insightful." In fact, Isabel had been the key to everything from the beginning. Her seemingly innocent drawings in the sessions, with Dr. Olivia, contained clues that now made sense. The bluebird marked the exact location of the cabin, the bars on the windows weren't fantasy, and the locket, The locket that Clarice had given to her daughter wasn't just a family heirloom. Inside it, cleverly hidden, were precise coordinates and a sequence of numbers, the combination of the safe where the physical evidence was kept. Elizabeth held the locket now, recovered thanks to an employee of the mansion who found it in Tobias's office. Her hands trembled as she remembered the last conversation with her sister 2 years before. "If something happens to me," Clarice had said, "look in the locket. Tobias will never imagine that I would entrust something so important to a family jewel." The rain began to fall harder, turning the winding road into an even greater challenge. The 3 cars maintained a safe distance between each other, following the established plan. However, something unexpected was about to happen. At the cabin, one of Tobias's oldest security guards, George, made his nightly rounds when he noticed something strange. Recent tire tracks in the mud, coming from a secondary road that few knew about. Someone had been there recently, someone who knew the alternative accesses to the property. Meanwhile, in the basement, Clarice heard unusual movement. Through her small observation crack, she saw men carrying gallons of fuel to different points of the cabin. Her blood ran cold as she understood. They weren't just planning to destroy the evidence, they were going to demolish the entire property. Rick's voice sounded through the security guard's radio. "The boss is 20 minutes out. Begin preparations." In his car, Tobias stared fixedly at the road ahead, his thoughts a storm as strong as the one forming in the sky. Next to him, Isabel had fallen asleep, exhausted from crying. The businessman looked at his daughter for a moment, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. "We have no choice," he murmured to himself. "We can't leave any trace." What he didn't know was that, at that exact moment, 5 different people were approaching his precious cabin, each carrying a piece of the puzzle that would destroy his carefully built empire. And at the center of it all, a woman, he thought. He had silenced, awaited her chance to reveal the truth. The storm raged louder and louder, as if nature itself wanted to participate in the confrontation that was about to happen. In a matter of minutes, all paths would converge to that isolated point in the Montana mountains, where secrets buried for 2 years would finally come to light. Lightning cut through the sky of the Montana mountains like flashes of a camera photographing destiny. The Ashtons' cabin, imposing against the stormy scenery, seemed like a medieval fortress guarding its dark secrets. The rain now fell in dense curtains, drastically reducing visibility on the road. Margaret and Elizabeth were the first to reach the established observation point, a small natural viewpoint protected by dense trees about half a mile from the cabin. From there they could see the security guards moving like agitated ants. "There are more men than usual," whispered Margaret, using binoculars. "They're carrying something. They look like gallons." Elizabeth felt her heart tighten. "We need to get in now. Clarice, my sister has been in there for 2 years. I can't wait any longer." The housekeeper held her companion's arm. "Let's stick to the plan. Patty and the others should arrive in minutes." In the cabin's basement, Clarice fought against the growing despair. The sounds above intensified. Hurried footsteps, furniture being dragged, tense voices exchanging orders. In 2 years of captivity, she had never noticed so much agitation. Her room, in fact, an improvised but frighteningly well-planned cell, had only the basics: a narrow bed, a tiny bathroom, and a small table where she ate her meals. The only window, covered by thick bars, was near the ceiling, allowing only a limited view of the outside. Through that crack, Clarice had marked the time by observing the changing seasons, the birds that nested near her window, the variations in the weather. That's how she maintained her sanity, creating a routine of observation that prevented her from plunging completely into the darkness of depression. But today, something was different. The smell. A distinctive odor of fuel began to seep through. The ventilation system. Her stomach churned as she understood Tobias's plan. He intended to destroy everything, including any evidence of her existence there. In the car approaching on the main road, Patty nervously checked her watch. Next to her, Mark finalized the last details of the report that would explode as soon as they had the physical evidence. In the back seat, Big Joe remained silent. His thoughts turned to Isabel. "I still can't believe it," he said finally. "How a father can do this to his own family." Patty adjusted the rearview mirror to look at him. "Power and money can corrupt anyone, Joe. But what Tobias didn't count on was that his greed would end up being his own downfall." The lawyer had discovered through a thorough investigation that Tobias Ashton's empire was built on a rotten foundation. The donations to the 4th of July parade were just the tip of the iceberg. There was a much larger scheme involving fraudulent bids, bribes, and money laundering. "The interesting thing," commented Mark, consulting his notes, "is that it all started to fall apart when he got too greedy. Clarice discovered the irregularities because he started to get careless, confident that no one would dare to question him." In the third car, Dr. Olivia and Stella approached on the secondary road using the former housekeeper's knowledge of the property's less guarded accesses. The psychologist couldn't stop thinking about her sessions with Isabel, especially the last one. "The girl knew," she said, breaking a long silence. "From the beginning she was trying to tell us through the drawings. The locket, the bluebirds, the bars. They weren't just manifestations of trauma, they were clues." Stella nodded, her wrinkled hands gripping an old folder. Mrs. Ashton was always very intelligent. She must have prepared Isabel, left clues that only her daughter would understand. The locket. She knew that Tobias would never attach importance to a family jewel. Inside the folder that Stella was carrying was the last piece of the puzzle, a detailed diary that she kept during her years working for the Ashtons. Every irregularity she noticed, every suspicious conversation she heard, every change in Tobias's behavior, everything was there, recorded with the precision of someone who knew that one day this information would be needed. At the cabin, Rick received a transmission over the radio. "Boss is 10 minutes out. Start procedures in 5. The head of security watched his men positioning the last gallons of fuel in strategic points of the property. The plan was simple. As soon as Tobias arrived with Isabel, they would start a controlled fire that would seem accidental. The basement, specially reinforced, would collapse first, eliminating any evidence of his darkest secret. What Rick didn't know was that one of his oldest security guards, George, was watching everything with growing unease. In 15 years, working for Tobias, he had closed his eyes to a lot of things. But this was different. George had been the first to notice the suspicious tire tracks. Now, standing at his guard post, he perceived movements in the shadows of the forest that surrounded the property. His experience told him that they weren't alone. At that moment, a particularly strong thunder shook the windows of the cabin. In the basement, Clarice startled at the noise. That's when she noticed the sound of the storm had revealed something she had never noticed before. One of the walls, vibrating with the thunder, produced a different echo, hollow. With a racing heart, she began to examine the wall more closely. After 2 years there, she knew every inch of her prison. How had she never noticed this before? Her fingers, groping. The seemingly solid surface found an almost imperceptible irregularity. She pressed lightly and felt something move. A small section of the plaster came loose, revealing a hidden space. Tremblingly, she reached into the hole, her fingers touching something familiar. Paper. Many papers. It took her brain a few seconds to process the discovery. She had found the original documents, the evidence that Tobias thought he had destroyed 2 years ago. Somewhere above, a door slammed shut. Exalted voices argued. The storm raged louder and louder, as if announcing the imminent arrival of the final confrontation. On the road, Tobias's car finally made the last turn that led to the cabin. Next, to him, Isabel woke up startled by a thunderclap. Her frightened eyes met the locket on the car's dashboard, where her father had carelessly tossed it. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice small but surprisingly firm, "why did you imprison Mommy?" Tobias braked abruptly, grabbing the locket and stuffing it into his pocket. His face was transformed by anger. "Never talk about that again, understand? Your mother is sick, you know that." "No," replied Isabel, silent tears streaming down her face. "She's not sick. She discovered your bad secrets." The businessman stared at his daughter, shocked by her lucidity. How could she know? Who else knew? His empire was beginning to crumble, and all because of a 6-year-old child. What he didn't realize was that, at that exact moment, 3 different cars were approaching from 3 distinct directions. 7 people, each carrying a part of the truth, converged on his cabin in the mountains. And in the basement, Clarice held in her hands the evidence that could destroy everything he had built. The storm roared, washing the Montana mountains with its primeval fury. In a matter of minutes, all paths would cross, and no amount of money or power would be able to stop the avalanche of truths that was about to come to light. The Ashtons' cabin cast ghostly shadows under the lightning when Tobias's car finally crossed the gates of the property. The rain relentlessly battered the terrain, turning the impeccable garden into a treacherous mud pit. Rick waited at the entrance, protected by a black umbrella, his face a mask of professional efficiency. "Is everything prepared?" asked Tobias, getting out of the car and pulling Isabel roughly by the arm. "Yes, sir. The strategic points have been marked. We're just waiting for your signal." The girl stared fixedly at one of the windows on the 2nd floor, as if she could see beyond the closed curtains. Her pale little face demonstrated an understanding far beyond her 6 years. Meanwhile, on the 3 different approaches to the cabin, the rescue plan began to unfold. Margaret and Elizabeth, taking advantage of the storm's cover, managed to approach the back of the property. The housekeeper knew the security guard's routine perfectly and knew that the laundry room door had a blind spot in the cameras. "There," she whispered, pointing to a low window partially covered by bushes. "It's the entrance to the basement. Tobias had that vegetation planted to disguise it, but I always took care of that garden personally." Elizabeth felt her heart race. After 2 years, she was yards away from her sister. Her hands trembled as she held the small device that Mark had provided, a tool capable of interfering with the security system for a few crucial minutes. On the main approach, Patty, Mark, and Big Joe prepared their distraction. The journalist had created a convincing fake ID, presenting himself as a city inspector for an emergency inspection. "We received reports of structural irregularities," he explained to the guard at the booth, his voice projecting authority. "With this storm, there's a risk of landslides. We need to do an immediate assessment." The guard hesitated, clearly without instructions for this situation. His radio crackled with interference, courtesy of Margaret and Elizabeth's device. On the 3rd approach, Dr. Olivia and Stella positioned themselves strategically near the garage. The former housekeeper knew a service passage that led directly to the kitchen, formerly used by the cleaning crew. "When I worked here," whispered Stella, "I discovered that the camera system has a weak spot. Every 30 minutes exactly, there's a 3-second reboot." Inside the cabin, Tobias led Isabel through the luxurious hallways, his footsteps echoing on the solid wood floor. The girl tried to memorize every detail, every sound, every smell, as her mother had taught her through codes and stories during those rare moments of secret contact. In the basement, Clarice frantically organized the documents found in the hollow wall. Her hands trembled as she separated the most important evidence: fraudulent contracts, altered receipts, compromising photographs, everything she had collected before being imprisoned, and that Tobias, in his arrogance, never imagined she could have hidden right there, in her own prison. The sound of footsteps above grew increasingly intense. Voices argued, doors slammed. The smell of fuel was getting stronger. In the garden, George, the oldest security guard, made his rounds with growing unease. Years of experience told him that something was wrong. The shadows seemed to move differently, as if the darkness were alive. His radio continued to experience interference. In a moment of clarity between the lightning, he saw figures moving in a coordinated way around the property. His first instinct was to sound the alarm, but something stopped him. The memories of 2 years ago when Clarice disappeared still haunted him. On that fateful night, he was on duty. He heard the screams, saw the bloodstains that later disappeared mysteriously. He remained silent, like everyone else, buying the story of the hospitalization for mental problems. But now, watching the shadows move with purpose, he felt that the moment of truth had arrived. Inside the main office, Tobias held Isabel by the shoulders, his fingers digging into the girl's delicate skin. "Where's the locket?" he demanded. "In your pocket, Daddy," she replied, her voice surprisingly calm. "But the key isn't in there anymore." The businessman reached into his pocket, grabbing the ancient jewel. His trembling fingers tried to open the secret compartment, only to find it empty. "What did you do?" A very subtle smile, impressively similar to her mother's, appeared on Isabel's face. "I gave the key to Aunt Margaret. Mommy said that I would know the right time." At the same instant, 3 simultaneous events shook the cabin. First, the security system went into total collapse. Not just the planned 3-second interval, but a complete failure. The cameras went off, the electric door locks opened. Second, a group of city inspectors, led by Mark and accompanied by Patty and Big Joe, invaded the main entrance, brandishing official documents and demanding immediate access to all areas of the property. Third, and most significantly, a sharp scream cut through the air. It came from the basement. Rick ran into the office. "Boss, we have problems. Many problems." Tobias pushed Isabel into a corner, his face contorted into a mask of fury. "Start the procedure, now!" But Rick hesitated, his normally impassive face showing real concern. "Sir, there are city inspectors here, journalists, and George is saying he saw movement in the back of the property." A particularly strong thunder shook the windows of the cabin. The lights flickered, plunging the property into darkness for a few crucial seconds. When they came back on, chaos was installed. Margaret and Elizabeth had gained access to the basement. Dr. Olivia and Stella infiltrated through the kitchen passage. Mark coordinated a news team that began broadcasting live from the location. Patty, wielding a court-ordered search warrant, advanced through the hallways with authority. In the midst of all this, Isabel took advantage of her father's distraction. To do something she had been mentally rehearsing for weeks, she ran. Her little feet knew the way. Her mother had described every hallway, every staircase, every door in their secret conversations. "Stop her!" Tobias roared, his control finally crumbling. But it was too late. In a matter of seconds, several events unfolded simultaneously. Clarice, emerging from her underground prison with a folder full of documents. Elizabeth, reuniting with her sister after 2 years of anguish. Margaret, using the locket key to open a hidden safe that Tobias thought was his best-kept secret. And at the center of it all, a 6-year-old girl running through the hallways of the mansion that had been her emotional prison, carrying in her heart all the truths that her father had tried so desperately to hide. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, an even bigger storm was about to explode. Decades of lies, manipulation, and crimes were about to come to light, and not all the power and money in the world could prevent what was about to come. The chaos that had broken out in the Ashtons' cabin was like a deranged symphony, each element contributing to a cacophony of revelations and confrontations. The once silent hallways now echoed with hurried footsteps, raised voices, and the distant sound of the storm that continued to batter the Montana mountains. Isabel ran through the hallways with the determination of someone who knows their destiny. Her small, bare feet barely touched the polished wood floor as she followed the path that her mother had described so many times in their secret conversations. Left in the main hallway, right in the library, down the service stairs, past the old cellar. Behind her, Tobias shouted increasingly desperate orders to his security guards. The businessman, always so controlled, now showed on his face all the fury of a man seeing his empire crumble. "Find my daughter, and stop anyone from reaching the basement." But it was too late. On the lower level of the cabin, Clarice emerged from her 2-year prison like a materialized ghost, carrying with her the evidence that could destroy Tobias's empire of lies. Her face was pale and gaunt, but her eyes shone with a renewed strength. Elizabeth was the first to reach her, enveloping her sister in a desperate hug. "My God, Clarice, you're alive. You're really alive." Margaret, who accompanied them, quickly began photographing the documents with her cell phone. "We need to make sure this evidence survives, no matter what happens," she said, her hands trembling as she scanned page after page of incriminating evidence. Upstairs, Patty Silver advanced through the hallways with the authority of someone carrying the law at her side. The court order in her hands was like a shield, opening a path through the increasingly hesitant security guards. "Ms. Silver." George, the oldest security guard, approached her discreetly. "There's something you need to see. In the surveillance room, we've recorded everything for the last 2 years. The security guard's face showed the weight of someone who had carried a heavy secret for too long. "I couldn't stand seeing what was happening anymore. I made copies of all the recordings, kept them in a safe place." Mark Pierce, who accompanied Patty with his news team, immediately understood the importance of that information. "Where are these recordings?" "In my locker, in the employees' lodging, inside an old Bible. No one would ever look there." Meanwhile, Dr. Olivia and Stella had gained access to the kitchen through the secret passage. The former housekeeper knew every inch of that house, every hiding place, every escape route. She was the one who first heard Isabel's light footsteps approaching. "There," she whispered, pointing to a small figure running past the back door of the kitchen. The girl stopped when she saw the 2 women, her eyes wide with surprise. But before they could reach her, a scream of rage echoed through the hallway. Tobias had found her trail. "Run!" Dr. Olivia shouted to Isabel. "Find your mother!" The scene that followed seemed to happen in slow motion. Isabel resumed her run, disappearing through a side door that led to the service area. Tobias emerged in the hallway seconds later, his face disfigured by fury. But before he could follow his daughter, he found his path blocked by Stella, the former housekeeper, that same woman he had threatened and fired 2 years ago, now stood in his way like an ancient and unshakable tree. "Enough, Tobias," she said, her voice carrying the weight of years of forced silence. "It's over." In the basement, Clarice frantically organized the documents, while Elizabeth and Margaret ensured that every page was photographed. The evidence was even more devastating than anyone could imagine. In addition to the already known corruption schemes, there was evidence of a much larger network of fraud. "He didn't just use the 4th of July parade," explained Clarice, her voice hoarse from disuse. "He had a whole network of cultural events, all used to launder money. Every town tradition, every celebration. He turned everything into a facade for his crimes." Margaret found something particularly interesting among the papers. "Look at this." payment records to politicians, judges, sheriffs. That's why he felt so untouchable. On the first floor, Rick tried to coordinate his men amidst the chaos, but he was quickly losing control of the situation. Several security guards, seeing the tide turning, began to lower their weapons. The evidence of Tobias's corruption was impossible to ignore. George, in a moment of final decision, used his master access to completely disable the security system. The doors opened, the cameras turned off, the electronic locks gave way. The cabin, once an impenetrable fortress, was now completely exposed. It was at that moment that Isabel finally found her way to the basement. The girl stopped at the entrance, her eyes fixed on the figure of her mother. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed. 2 years of forced separation, of trauma, of contained longing, all culminating in this one moment. "Mommy?" Isabel's voice was just a whisper. Clarice dropped the documents she was holding, her arms opening automatically to receive her daughter. "My love, my love." The embrace between mother and daughter was like an explosion of light amidst the darkness. Elizabeth and Margaret cried silently, witnessing the reunion that seemed impossible only hours before. But the peace was brutally interrupted. Tobias, having finally overcome Stella's blockade, burst down the stairs like an enraged bull. His eyes, upon finding Clarice embraced with Isabel, widened in a mixture of shock and fury. "Get away from my daughter," he growled, advancing. That's when multiple voices sounded at the same time. "Tobias Ashton!" Then Patty appeared at the top of the stairs, followed by police officers. "You are under arrest!" "It's all recorded," shouted Mark, his camera capturing every second. "Live to the whole state." "The evidence is here." Margaret raised her cell phone, showing the scanned documents. "All of it." The businessman stopped, his eyes running frantically from one face to another, looking for an exit that no longer existed. His empire, built on lies and violence, crumbled before his eyes like a house of cards. It was then that Isabel, still in her mother's arms, spoke with a wisdom beyond her years. "Daddy, the truth always comes out. You taught me that." The irony of those words coming from the lips of a 6-year-old child was the final blow. Tobias Ashton, the man who had built an empire through fear and manipulation, fell to his knees, defeated not by force or violence, but by the innocence and courage of his own daughter. The storm outside began to subside, as if nature itself recognized that its fury was no longer needed. The day began to dawn, its first rays penetrating through the windows of the basement, illuminating the final scene of a story that had begun on a very similar rainy night, when a lonely trucker stopped to help a frightened girl on the side of the road. The early hours of the morning brought a surreal calm to the Ashtons' cabin. The storm had passed, leaving behind a washed sky and a clean air that carried the scent of wet earth. However, inside the property, the shockwaves of the night's events continued to spread. Clarice didn't let go of Isabel, her arms embracing her daughter, as if she feared she might disappear at any moment. The girl, in turn, nestled against her mother with the familiarity of someone who had never been separated, as if the 2 years of physical distance had not affected the deep bond between them. "You've grown so much," murmured Clarice, running her fingers through her daughter's hair, "but your eyes remain exactly the same." Elizabeth watched the scene with silent tears streaming down her face, while methodically organizing the documents that her sister had preserved for so long. The evidence was overwhelming. Detailed spreadsheets of embezzlement, records of bribes, compromising photographs, a complex web of corruption that stretched throughout the town of Butte. Margaret, who had become much more than a simple housekeeper, over those years worked tirelessly alongside Patty Silver, ensuring that each piece of evidence was properly catalogued and protected. Her cell phone, containing the photographs of the documents, had already been connected to 3 different cloud services, ensuring that nothing could be lost or destroyed. "It's unbelievable," commented Patty, examining a particular set of documents. "He didn't just use the 4th of July parade for money laundering. Every cultural event, every traditional celebration in town had a specific scheme." Mark Pierce, who had transformed a corner of the room into an improvised broadcasting studio, coordinated his team with surgical precision. The story was being broadcast live to the entire state, but the journalist ensured that each detail was presented with the proper context and verification. "The people of Butte need to understand," he explained to his audience, "that it wasn't just financial resources that were stolen. It was something much deeper. The town's own culture was manipulated and exploited." Upstairs, Dr. Olivia conducted an emergency session with Isabel, now accompanied by her mother. The psychologist observed in awe how the girl, once so withdrawn and frightened, now spoke with a quiet confidence. "I knew Mommy wasn't sick," explained Isabel, her small fingers playing with the locket she had recovered. "She taught me to pay attention to the details, to memorize paths, to keep important secrets." Clarice smiled sadly. "I knew Tobias would never suspect a child. So in the few times I managed to make contact with Isabel, I turned everything into a game, into stories that would seem innocent to anyone who was listening." Dr. Olivia made some notes. "The drawings, the bluebirds, the barred windows, the locket, they weren't just manifestations of trauma. They were a code between you." "Each drawing had a meaning," confirmed Isabel, surprising the adults with her understanding. "The bluebirds only appear in this part of the mountains. The bars were to show where Mommy was, and the locket was the key to everything," completed Clarice, "literally and figuratively." On the first floor, Big Joe watched all the movement with a mixture of relief and disbelief. After months of being unjustly imprisoned, seeing the truth finally coming to light was almost surreal. Stella Grant, the former housekeeper, approached him with a cup of coffee. "You know," she said, sitting next to him, "when you found Isabel on that rainy night, it was the first time in 2 years that we had hoped that the truth could come out." The trucker took a sip of the coffee, allowing himself to relax for the first time in months. "I still can't believe all this. How can a man do something like this to his own family?" "Greed," replied George, the security guard who had joined. "Them. I saw it happen gradually. First there were small deviations, then bigger schemes. The power went to his head. When Clarice discovered the truth—" The security guard didn't complete the sentence, but it wasn't necessary. Everyone there now knew the extent of Tobias Ashton's cruelty. In the kitchen, Elizabeth prepared an improvised breakfast for everyone. It was a simple, almost domestic gesture, but loaded with meaning. For the first time in 2 years, her sister could eat a meal in freedom. "We need to think about the next steps," said Patty, joining the group in the kitchen. "Tobias still has many allies in town, powerful people who may try to interfere in the process." Mark nodded in agreement. "That's why the live broadcast was so important. Now that the story is public, it will be much harder to stifle the case." Margaret, who had just finished a call, brought more news. "The community is speaking up. Several people are coming forward with more information about Tobias's schemes. It's like a dam has burst." In the basement, now illuminated by powerful spotlights from the news team, experts catalogued every inch of the prison where Clarice spent 2 years. The improvised cell told a story of suffering, but also of resistance and intelligence. The marks on the walls, which seemed like simple scratches for counting days, were actually an elaborate system of notes that Clarice had developed. "She documented everything," explained one of the experts. "Every conversation she heard, every suspicious movement, every piece of information she managed to capture through the ventilation system. And she hid everything in a way that would seem random to any observer." Outside, the sun was already high in the sky, illuminating the property that had held such dark secrets for so long. The news of the events at the Ashtons' cabin spread rapidly through Butte, causing an uproar that went far beyond the initial scandal. It was a story that touched on something deep in the community, how their most cherished traditions, their most important celebrations, had been manipulated and corrupted to serve the interests of one man. But it was also a story of resistance, of maternal love, of childhood courage, and of how the truth, no matter how hidden, finds its way to the light. In a room upstairs, Isabel finally fell asleep in her mother's arms, exhausted but at peace. Clarice, caressing her daughter's hair, looked out the window at the new day that was dawning. After 2 years of darkness, the sunlight on her face had a taste of freedom that words could not describe. "Is it over?" asked Isabel sleepily, her eyes already closing. "Yes, my love," replied Clarice, kissing her daughter's forehead. "It's over. Now we can start over." But while mother and daughter rested in the other rooms of the cabin, the story was far from over. There was still much work to be done, many truths to be revealed, many wounds to be healed. The morning brought not only a new day, but the beginning of a new era for Butte and all those involved in that extraordinary story. The weeks that followed the events at the cabin were a whirlwind of revelations and changes in Butte. The town, which had always prided itself on its traditions and community values, now found itself forced to confront a disturbing reality: how one of its most prominent citizens had manipulated those very traditions for his own nefarious purposes. Clarice and Isabel had temporarily moved to Elizabeth's house, a small but cozy apartment in the center of town. Readjusting to normal life was a delicate process, full of small challenges and discoveries. For Clarice, even the simplest daily tasks seemed extraordinary after 2 years of confinement. "It's strange," she commented to Dr. Olivia during a therapy session, "how things that used to be so automatic now seem new. The noise of traffic, the wind on my face, even choosing what to wear in the morning." The psychologist, who now attended mother and daughter in joint and separate sessions, observed with professional admiration how both faced the healing process. Isabel, in particular, demonstrated extraordinary resilience. "Mommy," said the girl during one of the sessions, "remember when you taught me to tell stories with the bluebirds? Now we can see the real birds, not just in the drawings." It was true. From the balcony of Elizabeth's apartment, they could see the same birds that had served as a secret code for so long. Now, instead of symbols of imprisonment, they represented freedom. Margaret, who had officially resigned from the Ashton mansion, now dedicated herself to an ambitious project. With the help of Patty Silver, she was organizing a support group for employees of wealthy families who witnessed situations of abuse and didn't know how to act. The fear of unemployment, of retaliation, often makes us silent, she explained during the group's first meeting. But there is strength in unity, in sharing information. Big Joe, completely exonerated and with his reputation restored, faced his own battles. The trauma of the months of unjust imprisonment didn't disappear easily, but he found solace in an unexpected place, in Isabel's regular visits. Uncle Joe, as she now called him, had become a constant presence in the girl's life. Every Thursday, he took her for ice cream, a simple ritual that helped both process the traumatic events they had lived through. "You know," he said to Clarice during one of those afternoons, "for a long time after the accident that took my family, I thought I would never find a purpose again. That night on the road, it was as if something bigger than myself was guiding me." Mark Pierce, in turn, delved deeper and deeper into the investigation. The initial story had turned into a series of investigative reports that exposed not only Tobias's crimes, but an entire system of corruption rooted in the region. Every Document we analyze opens a new Pandora's box, he explained during a meeting with Patty. The 4th of July parade schemes were just the tip of the iceberg. There was an entire network of cultural events, all transformed into money laundering mechanisms. The lawyer nodded, leafing through a pile of lawsuits. And the saddest thing is how he managed to corrupt genuine community traditions. The 4th of July parade in Butte has always been a time of unity, of celebrating local culture. He transformed that into a facade for his crimes. The revelations provoked a profound reflection in the community. Local leaders, businessmen, and cultural organizers met frequently to discuss ways to restore the integrity of the town's traditional celebrations. We cannot allow the actions of one man to destroy decades of tradition, argued Mrs. Thompson, one of the oldest organizers of the 4th of July parade, during a community assembly. We need to rebuild, but this time with total transparency. Meanwhile, Stella Grant, the former housekeeper, found her own form of healing through testimony. Her detailed diary, kept during years of work in the Ashton mansion, had become a fundamental piece not only for the investigation, but for the wider understanding of how the abuse of power can manifest in domestic relationships. Every little detail I wrote down, she explained during an interview with Mark. Every suspicious conversation, every strange behavior. At the time, it seemed just a way to maintain my sanity. Now I see that it was my conscience forcing me to create a record of the truth. George, the security guard who had helped expose the truth, faced his own consequences. Some of his former colleagues considered him a traitor, but he found peace in his decision. I spent years convincing myself that I was just doing my job, he confided to Margaret. But there's a difference between loyalty and complicity. I learned that the hard way. For Isabel, each day brought new discoveries and reconnections. Her keen observational skills, developed during the years of forced separation from her mother, now manifested in more positive ways. She had begun to write her own stories, always involving bluebirds and secret messages. It's a way to re-signify the trauma, explained Dr. Olivia during a meeting with Clarice. She is transforming survival tools into instruments of creativity. The town of Butte also went through its own process of transformation. The investigations had exposed a network of corruption that extended far beyond Tobias's crimes. Several local politicians and businessmen were being investigated, and a new wave of transparency and citizen participation began to emerge. It's as if the town is waking up from a nightmare, commented Elizabeth during a family dinner. But sometimes you have to face the darkness to be able to see the light more clearly. Clarice, watching her daughter play on the balcony with the bluebirds, reflected on how the truth, even when buried in the depths of a dark basement, always found a way to the surface. Her confinement had been a traumatic experience, but it had also revealed a strength she didn't know she possessed. "Mommy," called Isabel from the balcony, "come see. The birds made a new nest." It was a small moment of everyday joy, the kind of thing that had previously seemed impossible. Clarice joined her daughter, hugging her as they watched the bluebirds build their home. It was an appropriate metaphor for their own lives. After the storm, reconstruction. Night fell on Butte, but unlike that fateful night on the road, there was now peace in the air. The truth had emerged, and with it, the possibility of a new beginning. However, no one could imagine that there was still one last revelation to come, one that would change everything once again. Autumn arrived in Butte, bringing winds of change. The trees on the central square began to turn golden, and with them, new revelations colored the story that had shocked the town. Mark Pierce was in his office at the newspaper, reviewing for the 100th time the case notes, when he received a call that would change everything again. "Mr. Pierce," the voice on the other end of the line was hesitant, almost whispering. My name is Anthony Miller. I was the accountant for the Ashton Construction Company for 15 years. There's something you need to know. The journalist had already learned to recognize that tone. It was the voice of someone who carried a secret too heavy to keep alone. He arranged a meeting for that same afternoon at the most discreet coffee shop in town. Meanwhile, in the new house that Clarice had rented, a simple but cozy house on the outskirts of town, Isabel played in the garden under the watchful eye of her mother. The girl had developed a peculiar interest in gardening, especially in blue flowers that attracted the birds that had so much meaning in her story. "Mommy," she called, her small hands dirty with earth, "can I plant more bee balms? The bluebirds like it when they bloom." Clarice smiled, but her smile carried a note of concern. Earlier that day, she had received a disturbing call from Patty Silver. The lawyer had discovered something in the documents recovered from the cabin that didn't make sense, numbers that didn't add up, dates that didn't align. "There's something bigger here," Patty had said. Something that even Tobias didn't know was happening in his own company. In the house next door, Margaret, who had moved close to Clarice to maintain proximity to Isabel, organized another meeting of her support group. What had started as a small circle of domestic employees had turned into a network of informants and whistleblowers from various sectors of society. "Each story I hear," she shared with Elizabeth during an afternoon, "coffee makes me realize that the Ashton case was just a symptom of something much deeper in our town." That same afternoon, Big Joe made his first official trip as the owner of his new trucking company, a modest venture financed with the compensation he had received for the time he was unjustly imprisoned. While driving on the same road where it all began, he noticed something curious: renovation work being carried out on the exact stretch where he had found Isabel. "Strange," he murmured to himself. "This work wasn't in the municipal planning." At the coffee shop in the center, Mark met with the former accountant. Anthony Miller was a middle-aged man with a common appearance, the type that would easily get lost in a crowd, but the information he carried was anything but common. "The scheme was much bigger than you imagine," he explained, his hands trembling as he handed a folder to the journalist. Tobias wasn't at the top of the pyramid. He was just a piece in a much bigger game. The documents that Anthony presented told a terrifying story. The Ashton Construction Company was part of a network that extended throughout the state. The 4th of July parade in Butte wasn't an isolated case. There were dozens of cultural events in different towns, all connected by an elaborate money laundering scheme. That's why the numbers in Clarice's documents didn't add up, realized Mark. She had only discovered one part of the puzzle. In her office, Dr. Olivia received an unexpected visitor. George, the former security guard at the cabin, had scheduled a consultation. During the session, he revealed something disturbing. "The recordings I handed over, there were more, many more. Tobias received regular visits from important people, high-ranking politicians. They discussed something called Project Renaissance." The psychologist immediately contacted Patty. The lawyer, who was already immersed in the new discoveries, felt the pieces begin to fit together. "Project Renaissance," she explained during an emergency meeting with Mark and Clarice, was a plan for cultural revitalization that encompassed the entire state. On the surface, it seemed like a legitimate project to preserve local traditions. "But in reality," completed Clarice, her eyes widening with understanding, "it was a sophisticated network of embezzlement of public funds. The cultural events were just a facade." Elizabeth, who had begun her own parallel investigation through contacts abroad, brought one more piece of the puzzle. Documents showing suspicious international transfers, all connected to a cultural consulting firm. They weren't just laundering local money, she explained. They were receiving resources from outside the country, turning genuine traditions into instruments of international fraud. In the garden of her new house, Isabel continued to plant her blue flowers, oblivious to the revelations that were unfolding. But even in her innocence, the girl had developed a keen sensitivity to the truth. "Mommy," she said while planting another seedling, "did you know that some flowers only grow after others die?" The teacher explained that that's how nature renews itself. Clarice felt a chill upon hearing the word renews. It was too close to Renaissance to be a coincidence. Her daughter, unknowingly, had touched on something profound. Meanwhile, Stella made a crucial discovery in her old diary. Among her meticulous notes about the routine of the mansion, there were records of seemingly unimportant conversations that now took on new meaning. They always spoke in code, she explained to Margaret. When they mentioned sewing culture, they weren't talking about art or tradition. They were talking about money. The community of Butte, still recovering from the initial shock of the Ashton case, now faced an even more disturbing reality. It wasn't just their 4th of July parade that had been corrupted. It was an entire system of values and traditions that had been manipulated to serve nefarious interests. Mark, working tirelessly on his new series of reports, realized that he was facing something unprecedented. "It's no longer just the story of one family," he explained to his team. "It's the story of how corruption can infiltrate the very cultural fabric of a society." At the end of that afternoon, as the sun set over Butte, Clarice watched her daughter playing in the garden. The blue flowers that Isabel planted seemed like a symbol of hope, small acts of genuine renewal in a world marked by falsehoods. But as night fell, no one could imagine that the biggest revelation was still to come. A revelation that would not only change the understanding of everything that had happened, but also shake the very foundations of power in Montana. Dawn in Butte brought an atmosphere charged with expectation. In the newspaper's newsroom, Mark Pierce had barely slept, his bloodshot eyes fixed on the computer screen as he connected the dots of a conspiracy that was proving to be much larger than anyone could imagine. The information brought by the former accountant Anthony Miller had triggered an avalanche of new discoveries. "It's almost unbelievable," he murmured to Patty Silver, who had just arrived with another pile of documents. Project Renaissance wasn't just a money laundering scheme. It was a systematic operation of cultural appropriation. The lawyer spread the papers on the makeshift table they had set up. "Look at this." She pointed to a complex organizational chart. Every town in the state had its own traditional celebration. 4th of July parades, harvest festivals, all were gradually infiltrated by the same group. On the other side of town, Clarice was preparing Isabel for another day of school when she received an urgent message from Elizabeth. Her sister, who had spent the night analyzing the international transfers, found something disturbing. "The cultural consulting firms," Elizabeth explained, arriving breathless at her sister's house, "were all registered in the names of straw men. But I managed to trace the money to a particular holding company. Guess who the real owner is?" Before she could reveal the name, they were interrupted by a call from Margaret. The former housekeeper was panicked. "You need to see this," she said, sending a video link by cell phone. It was an old recording, recovered from the cabin's archives, showing a meeting that had taken place 2 years before. In the recording, partially corrupted but still audible, Tobias was talking to a man whose face remained in the shadows. "We can't allow his wife to continue snooping," said the unknown voice. "Project Renaissance is bigger than all of us. If she discovers the true extent..." The recording ended abruptly, but it was enough to confirm the suspicions that had been growing. Tobias, with all his arrogance and cruelty, was just a pawn in a much bigger game. Meanwhile, at Isabel's school, something unexpected happened. During the local history class, where the children were learning about the traditions of Butte, the girl raised her hand with an innocent question that left her teacher astonished. "Why can't we wear the old clothes at the 4th of July parade?" she questioned. "My mom said that everyone used to make their own clothes, but now you have to buy them from a specific company." The teacher, Carol Bennett, felt a chill. For years, she had silently questioned the gradual commercialization of local traditions, but she had never been able to put the pieces together. Isabel's question sparked a light in her mind. That same afternoon, Carol looked for Mark at the newspaper. She brought with her decades of school records about the town's cultural celebrations. "Look at this," she showed. "It started 15 years ago. First it was the clothes, then the food, then the music. Every aspect of the parade was being standardized, commercialized." The journalist felt his heart race as he examined the documents. It wasn't just about laundering money, he realized. They were systematically destroying the authenticity of local traditions, replacing everything with controlled commercial versions. Big Joe, who had expanded his new trucking company, began to notice a curious pattern in his travels around the region. In every town, he found the same model of cultural revitalization being implemented, the same companies supplying products, the same consultants guiding the festivities. "It's as if someone is trying to create a pasteurized version of our culture," he commented during a dinner at Clarice's house, "something that could be easily controlled and exploited." Stella, leafing through her old diary, found more clues. Notes about secret meetings at the cabin, names of important politicians and businessmen, always associated with discussions about cultural preservation and modernizing traditions. The former housekeeper shared her discoveries with George, the former security guard, who immediately recognized some of the names. "These men," he said, "were regular visitors to the cabin. They always arrived late at night, always left before dawn." Dr. Olivia, analyzing her sessions with Isabel in a new light, realized that the girls' drawings contained more meaning than they imagined. The bluebirds, which everyone assumed were just a reference to the location of the cabin, appeared in specific patterns. "Look at this," she showed Clarice, spreading the drawings in chronological order. "Your daughter wasn't just marking locations. She was, unconsciously, mapping a network. Each flight pattern of the birds corresponds to a route between the towns involved in the scheme." Margaret, through her support group, began to receive similar reports from other towns. Domestic employees, drivers, security guards, all sharing. Stories that, when put together, formed a frightening mosaic of manipulation and control. The truth that emerged was devastating. Project Renaissance was an operation calculated to decharacterize the authentic cultural traditions of the state, replacing them with commercial versions controlled by a select group of powerful people. Money laundering was just one aspect of the scheme. Patty, reorganizing her evidence for a new lawsuit, realized the perverse genius of the plan. They weren't just stealing money, she explained. They were stealing the very cultural identity of communities. As night fell on Butte, Clarice watched her daughter playing in the garden. Isabel had created a small ritual. Every afternoon, she left seeds for the bluebirds, carefully observing their flight patterns. "Mommy!" she called suddenly. "Look! The birds are different today. There are a lot more of them, and they're all flying together." Clarice approached the window, and her heart almost stopped. In the sky, an unprecedented number of bluebirds flew over the town, as if they were signaling something. That's when her phone rang. It was Mark. "Clarice." The journalist's voice trembled with excitement. "We need to talk. I just received information that changes everything. The true architect of Project Renaissance. You won't believe who it is." At that moment, in different parts of the town, all the pieces began to fit together. The final truth, the one that no one had predicted, was about to come to light, and with it, the understanding that the Ashton case was just the beginning of a much larger story. The final revelation of the case that had shaken Butte exploded on a Thursday morning, exactly 1 year after that rainy night when Big Joe found Isabel on the side of the road. The sun had barely risen when Mark Pierce convened an emergency meeting at his house, a safer location than the newspaper's newsroom for what he was about to share. Clarice arrived first, accompanied by Elizabeth. Isabel had been left in the care of Margaret, who had transformed her house into an advanced operations post for the support group that now extended throughout the state. One by one, the people who had become key players in that story arrived. Patty Silver with her folders of documents, Stella with her precious diary, George carrying the latest recovered recordings, and Big Joe, who had cancelled an important delivery, to be present. "What we discovered," began Mark, his voice trembling slightly as he spread documents on the living room table, "goes far beyond Tobias Ashton and the 4th of July parade in Butte. Project Renaissance wasn't just a money laundering scheme. It was part of a much more ambitious plan." Patty picked up one of the documents, an apparently innocent cultural consulting contract. "Look at the signature at the bottom," she pointed out. "Walter Sterling, State Secretary of Culture for 20 years, the same man who appears in the shadows in that recording from the cabin. But he's known for his work in cultural preservation," exclaimed Elizabeth, incredulous. "Exactly," continued Mark. "The perfect facade. While publicly presenting himself as a defender of traditions, behind the scenes he orchestrated their complete de-characterization." The journalist projected a complex organizational chart on the wall. At the top wasn't Walter Sterling, as everyone expected, but a name that made Clarice pale: Robert Ashton, Tobias's father. "Robert stepped away from the family business 15 years ago," explained Clarice, her voice a whisper. "Tobias always said he had retired to live abroad." "In fact," interrupted Patty, "he never left the country. Using a network of shell companies and false identities, Robert created Project Renaissance as a form of systematic cultural control." The lawyer explained that the plan was frighteningly simple in its genius. First, they identified towns with strong cultural traditions. Then, through specialized consultants, they began to suggest modernizations to local celebrations. Gradually, authentic elements were replaced by standardized versions, all provided by companies controlled by the group. "The 4th of July parades were just the beginning," continued Mark. "They did the same with harvest festivals, religious celebrations, music festivals. Every aspect of popular culture was being subtly modified, commercialized, and controlled." Stella leafed through her diary with trembling hands. "Now I understand why Tobias got so nervous when his father was mentioned. He wasn't the mastermind. He was just another executor of the plan." George added his own discovery: the nighttime meetings at the cabin. The man in the shadows wasn't Walter Sterling. It was Robert Ashton, using the secretary as a front. It was then that Big Joe, who had been silent until then, made a surprising connection. "The road work where I found Isabel are all companies linked to the same group. They're not just controlling the traditions, they're literally reshaping the infrastructure of the towns for their purposes." Clarice felt a chill as she remembered something Isabel had said that morning. The girl, playing with her bluebirds, had commented, "Did you know that the birds no longer nest in the old places? The teacher said it's because they changed all. The trees in the square, that was it. Even the natural landscape of the towns was being altered to serve the interests of the group. Native trees replaced by ornamental species. Historic squares revitalized with standardized materials, all part of a larger plan of cultural decharacterization." Margaret, who had just arrived after leaving Isabel at school, brought another piece of the puzzle. Through her support group, she had discovered that the same pattern was repeated in dozens of towns. Old employees replaced, traditions modified, memories erased. It's not just about money, concluded Patty. It's about control. Whoever controls the culture of a people controls their identity. It was at that moment that Dr. Olivia, who had been following everything in silence, had an epiphany. Running to her folder, she took out Isabel's drawings, spreading them on the table. "Look," she exclaimed, "the patterns of the birds in the drawings aren't roots, they're dates. Each formation corresponds to a significant change in the town." Isabel was unconsciously recording the transformation of Butte. The revelation hit everyone like a lightning bolt. A 6-year-old child, through her innocent art, had documented what adults couldn't see, the gradual erosion of the cultural identity of her town. Mark turned on his laptop, showing the report he had prepared. It was devastating in its completeness. Documents, photos, recordings, testimonies, all pointing to a conspiracy that spanned decades. "I'm going to publish it tomorrow," he said, "but there's one more thing you need to see." The journalist played a recent recording, made secretly during a meeting in Walter Sterling's office. In it, Robert Ashton, his voice unmistakable despite the years, discussed the next phase of the project. "Butte was just a test," he said. "With the success here, we can expand to other states. In 10 years, we will have standardized all the cultural manifestations of the South." The silence that followed was heavy. Each person in the room processed the magnitude of what they had discovered. It wasn't just a story of corruption or family abuse. It was a systematic attempt to erase the cultural identity of an entire region. "What do we do now?" asked Elizabeth, her voice trembling. It was Clarice who answered, her voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone. "We do what we've always done. We tell the truth. But this time, not just about one man or one family. We tell the truth about how we almost lost something much more precious than money, our own story." At that moment, as if responding to an invisible call, the bluebirds began to gather in the skies of Butte. Hundreds of them, flying in formations that resembled those in Isabel's drawings. It was as if nature itself was protesting against the attempts to control it. At school, Isabel watched the birds through the classroom window, a small smile on her lips. Without knowing it, she had been the first to see the truth, expressing through her drawings what adults had taken so long to understand. The story that had begun with a frightened girl on the side of a rainy road had transformed into something much larger, a fight for the preservation not only of lives or reputations, but of the very soul of a community. And as the sun set over Butte on that historic night, the bluebirds continued their flight as guardians of a truth that could no longer be hidden. The town, finally free from the weight of so many secrets, began its own journey of rebirth. Not the false rebirth planned in dark offices, but a true awakening, fueled by the courage of ordinary people who refused to let their story be erased. In the garden of her new house, Clarice and Isabel planted more blue flowers, preparing a new nest for the birds that had become a symbol of their freedom. The future was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. The truth, like those small flowers, would always find a way to sprout no matter how much they tried to suffocate it.